The massive starship called the Starlight Throne moved slowly through the empty darkness of neutral space, its golden hull catching the distant light of faraway stars and glowing like a small sun against the black void around it. This was no ordinary vessel, but the personal transport of Queen Silithara, ruler of the Valenthari Empire, one of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy. And she was traveling to attend a great meeting of species, called the Concordat Summit, where leaders from dozens of worlds would gather to discuss matters of trade and peace. The Valenthari were tall beings with skin that shimmered like moonlight on water, their eyes large and filled with colors that shifted with their emotions, and they moved with a grace that made other species feel clumsy and rough by comparison. They had ruled their corner of space for thousands of years, and they considered themselves the most refined and cultured of all the galaxy's children. Among the many passengers aboard the Starlight Throne was a single human, a man named Commander Marcus Chun, who served as a cultural liaison between humanity and the alien races. They had only recently begun to meet humans, were new to the galactic community, having discovered faster than light travel only a few decades earlier, and most alien species still viewed them with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The Valenthari in particular seemed unsure what to make of these strange primates from a small blue world on the edge of explored space. They had heard stories about humans, tales of their endless wars against each other, their ability to survive in almost any environment, and their unsettling habit of forming emotional bonds with anything that moved. From their fellow humans to animals to machines, Commander Chun kept mostly to himself during the voyage, spending his time in his small quarters reading or in his private reading room, studying Valenthari customs so he would not embarrass himself at the summit. He was a quiet man in his middle years with kind eyes and gray beginning to show at his temples, and the few Valenthari who interacted with him found him polite but difficult to understand. Why did he smile so much? They wondered, and why did he always ask about the welfare of the servants and guards as if their comfort mattered to him personally? Queen Silithara paid the human little attention because she had far more important concerns on her mind. Traveling with her were her 3 daughters, the young princesses of the Valenthari Empire, and protecting them occupied most of her thoughts. Princess Aleth was the eldest at 12 years old by human counting, a serious girl who already showed signs of her mother's sharp intelligence and commanding presence. Princess Naira was 10, wild and curious, and always asking questions that made her tutors uncomfortable. And then there was little Princess Disha, only 6 years old, the baby of the family, sweet and shy and adored by everyone who met her. The princesses were kept in luxurious chambers at the heart of the ship, surrounded by guards and servants and every comfort imaginable. Valenthari children of royal blood were considered sacred, precious beyond measure, and the idea that any harm might come to them was unthinkable. 20 elite guards stood watch outside their doors at all hours, and sophisticated security systems monitored every centimeter of the space around them. Nothing could possibly go wrong, and yet something did go wrong. It happened during the ship's night cycle when the lights dimmed to simulate evening, and most of the passengers retreated to their quarters to rest. The head servant went to check on the princesses before the final meal of the day and found their chambers empty. The beds were neat and untouched, and the toys lay scattered across the floor as if the children had been playing just moments before. But the princesses themselves had vanished. The servant screamed within minutes. The entire ship descended into chaos as guards rushed through the corridors and alarms blared through every deck. Commander Velthos, the ship's security chief, arrived at the royal chambers with his face pale and his hands shaking because he knew that his life was now forfeit. If the children were not found, Queen Silithara came moments later, and the terror in her shifting eyes was terrible to behold. Where were her daughters? And who had taken them, and how had anyone breached the most secure section of the entire vessel? The questions flew like weapons, but no one had answers. Velthos ordered a complete lockdown of the ship and began systematic searches of every room and corridor and storage space, while his officers reviewed security footage from hundreds of cameras. But the footage showed nothing useful, because somehow the princesses had slipped away through passages the cameras did not cover. Small maintenance quarters designed for repair drones. Spaces too cramped for adult Velanthari to enter it. It was as if the children had simply dissolved into the walls of the ship, and then someone remembered the UN Commander Chun had been seen walking near the royal section earlier that day, apparently lost and looking for directions to the observation deck. He had spoken briefly with one of the guards and then wandered away. But now that innocent encounter seemed sinister. What if it had been reconnaissance, and what if the human had been planning something terrible? The Velanthari advisors gathered around their queen and spoke in urgent whispers about what they knew of humans. These were creatures born from a world of predators, they said. Beings who had clawed their way to dominance through violence and cunning, knew what dark purposes might lurk behind those strange round eyes and those unsettling smiles. Perhaps the humans sought to ransom the princesses, or perhaps he served some hidden master who wished to strike at the Velanthari Empire through its most vulnerable members. Queen Silithara listened to her advisors with ice forming around her heart, because her children were missing, and she would do anything to get them back. She gave the order, and within the hour, Commander Marcus Chen was dragged from his quarters in restraints, confused and frightened, but not resisting, and thrown into a holding cell deep in the belly of the ship. The human was their only suspect, and until the princesses were found, he would remain a prisoner. And if her daughters had been harmed, the queen thought grimly, then no force in the galaxy would save him from her wrath. The alien queen's daughters disappeared, and they were found laughing, safely guarded inside the human's quarters. Part 2. The Hunt Commander Velthos had served the Velanthari crown for 30 years and had faced pirates and rebels and assassins without ever knowing true fear. But now his hands would not stop trembling as he directed the search for the missing princesses. Every minute that passed felt like a blade pressing deeper into his chest, because he understood perfectly well what would happen if the children were not found alive and unharmed. His career would end, and his family would be disgraced, and he himself would likely face execution for failing in his most sacred duty. So he drove his guards without mercy, sending them through every corridor and chamber and storage compartment aboard the Starlight Throne until they were staggering with exhaustion. The great ship was vast, designed to carry thousands of passengers in comfort worthy of royalty, and searching it completely was a task that would normally take days. But Velthos did not have days, because somewhere in this maze of metal and light 3 small girls were lost, or trapped, or worse. And every passing hour made the terrible possibilities multiply in his mind. The security teams used every tool at their disposal, from heat scanners that could detect body warmth through walls to audio sensors that could pick up a whisper from 50 meters away. They searched the cargo holds where crates of diplomatic gifts sat waiting for the summit, and the engineering sections where the great engines hummed with power, and the passenger quarters where frightened travelers huddled behind locked doors, wondering what disaster had befallen the ship. They found nothing, meanwhile, in his holding cell deep below the main decks. Commander Marcus Chun sat on a hard bench and tried to understand what was happening. The guards who had arrested him had said something about the princesses disappearing, but their Velanthari was rapid and accented, and he had caught only fragments of their accusations. Children missing, they had said, and humans suspected. And then they had pushed him into this cold gray room and sealed the door behind. Then Chun was not a man who panicked easily, because his years of diplomatic service had taught him patience and calm in difficult situations, but he could not deny the fear that crept through him as hours passed and no one came to explain the charges against him. Knew how aliens often viewed his species as dangerous and unpredictable creatures, barely removed from their violent past. And he knew that fear could make even civilized beings do terrible things. So when Commander Velthos finally appeared at his cell with 2 armed guards, Chun stood and faced them with as much dignity as he could manage. The interrogation that followed was intense, but not cruel, because the Velanthari were not a K species that enjoyed causing pain, and Velthos was more interested in answers than punishment. The security chief asked about Chun's movements throughout the day, and his contacts with other passengers, and his reasons for walking near the royal chambers. Chun answered every question honestly and completely, explaining that he had simply gotten lost while exploring the ship and had asked a guard for directions before continuing on his way. He had never seen the princesses and had no idea where they might be, and the very suggestion that he might harm children made his stomach turn with revulsion. Something in the human's voice gave Velthos pause, because this man did not sound like a kidnapper or an assassin. He sounded confused and worried and genuinely upset at the thought that young ones might be in danger. When Chun asked hesitantly about the princesses, wanting to know their ages and whether they might be frightened wherever they were, Velthos found himself answering almost without thinking. Galeth was 12 and very responsible, he said, and Naira was 10 and curious about everything, and little Desha was only 6 and probably terrified to be separated from her mother. Chun listened with an expression of deep concern that seemed impossible to fake, and then he asked if there was anything he could do to help with the search. Velthos did not know what to make of this strange creature who seemed to care about children he had never met, but he ordered his guards to search Chun's quarters once more while the human remained in custody. The search revealed nothing suspicious, only books and personal items and a small security drone that humans apparently carried for protection when traveling in unfamiliar space. The drone was dormant and harmless, and the guards quickly dismissed it as unimportant. Back in the cell, Velthos admitted grudgingly that he could find no evidence connecting Chun to the disappearance, but the human would remain confined until the princesses were recovered. Chun accepted this without complaint and asked only that he be informed when the children were found safe. As Velthos turned to leave, a young officer rushed up with news that made the security chief's heart leap with desperate hope. They had discovered that several maintenance hatches in the royal section showed signs of recent tampering, and the hatches led into a network of narrow tunnels designed for repair drones and cable maintenance. Adult Velanthari could not fit through these passages, but children certainly could. And perhaps the princesses had not been taken at all. Perhaps they had simply crawled into the walls on some childish adventure and become lost in the labyrinth of tiny corridors. It was a thin hope, but Velthos seized it with both hands and immediately ordered drones into the maintenance network to search for any sign of the missing girls. The hunt continued as the hours stretched on and Queen Silithar waited in her chambers with her advisors, her fear slowly transforming into something cold and hard and ready to strike at whoever had taken her precious daughters from her. She did not know that the answer was closer than anyone suspected, hidden in the most unlikely place aboard the ship, and that her children were not suffering at all, but were in fact having the time of their young lives. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when a small maintenance drone doing routine repairs in the lower decks picked up something strange on its audio sensors. The drone was a simple machine, not truly intelligent but capable of recognizing patterns and reporting anomalies to the ship's central computer, and the sounds it detected were definitely anomalous because they were high and rhythmic and almost musical in their rise and fall. The central computer analyzed the audio and flagged it for review by the security team because the sounds matched the vocal patterns of young Velantari. When Commander Velthus received the alert, he nearly collapsed with relief because after so many hours of searching, this was the first real lead they had found. He gathered a team of his best guards and rushed to the lower decks, following the coordinates the drone had provided to a section of the ship that most passengers never saw. This was storage territory, filled with spare parts and emergency supplies and other mundane necessities that kept the Starlight Throne functioning. During long voyages, the audio signal led them to a heavy door that Velthos did not immediately recognize, but a quick check of the ship's records revealed it was a small reading room that had been assigned to the human ambassador as part of his personal quarters. The security chief felt his suspicion of Marcus Chun flare back to life, because why would the princesses be here of all places, in the room of the one passenger who had been deemed most likely to harm them? He ordered his guards to prepare their weapons, and then he triggered the emergency override on the door, ready for whatever horror might await them inside. The door slid open, and Velthos charged through with his guards right behind him, their weapons raised and their eyes scanning for threats. What they found stopped them all in their tracks. The room was small but comfortable, filled with shelves of data crystals and a few pieces of human furniture that looked strange and blocky compared to the elegant Velanthari designs elsewhere on the ship. But Velthos barely noticed the decor because his attention was entirely captured by the scene before him. The three princesses were sitting in the middle of the floor, surrounded by a nest of blankets and pillows that had been pulled from somewhere and arranged into a cozy little fortress. Little Desha was curled up against a large pillow, with her eyes half closed and a peaceful smile on her face, clearly fighting sleep, but too comfortable to surrender to it. Elith and Naira were huddled together over a datapad, their shoulders shaking with laughter as they watched something on the screen. Empty food containers lay scattered around them, the remains of what appeared to be human snacks, and holographic picture books floated in the air nearby, their pages frozen on images of strange alien creatures that Velthos did not recognize. And standing guard near the only entrance to the room was a small mechanical device that hummed quietly as it tracked the movement of the newly arrived guards. It was the human security drone, Velthos realized, the same harmless machine his officers had dismissed during their search of Chun's quarters. Except now it did not seem quite so harmless because its sensors were locked onto the guards, and a soft warning tone had begun to emanate from its speakers, as if it was prepared to defend its position against intruders. The princesses looked up at the commotion, and their faces shifted from surprise to delight when they saw the familiar uniforms of the royal guard. Nara jumped to her feet and ran toward the guards with her arms spread wide, crying out that they had finally been found, and asking if they could please stay just a little longer, because the humans' picture books were so interesting. Alith followed more slowly with the dignity expected of the eldest princess, but even she could not hide the smile that tugged at her lips, and little Desha simply yawned and stretched and asked in a sleepy voice if it was time for dinner yet. Velthos stood frozen as his guards lowered their weapons and stared at the scene before them with expressions of utter confusion. The princesses were unharmed and unafraid, and apparently having a wonderful time. There were no kidnappers and no villains and no dark conspiracy. Just three young girls who had somehow found their way to the humans' reading room and made themselves at home. The security chief did not understand how this had happened or why the children seemed so comfortable in this strange place. But those questions could wait because right now the only thing that mattered was informing the queen that her daughters were safe. He spoke quickly into his communicator, his voice cracking with emotion as he reported that the princesses had been found alive and well in the lower decks. Then he turned back to the room and watched as his guards gently coaxed the children to their feet and wrapped them in warm blankets for the journey back to their mother. The small security drone powered down as the princesses were led away, its purpose apparently fulfilled. And Velthos found himself staring at it with new eyes. What kind of machine was this, he wondered, that would watch over lost children as if they were precious cargo to be protected? And what kind of people built such machines? He did not yet have answers to these questions, but he suspected that the coming hours would reveal truths about humans that no Valentari had ever imagined. Queen Silithara moved through the corridors of her ship like a storm given physical form, her robes flowing behind her and her eyes blazing with emotions too complex to name. Relief and fury and confusion all warred within her as she raced toward the lower decks where her daughters had been found. And the guards and servants who saw her coming pressed themselves against the walls to let her pass. She had spent hours imagining the worst possible fates for her children, torturing herself with visions of suffering and loss. And now she learned they had been playing in the human's quarters all along. The human who currently sat in a cell because she had ordered his arrest. The human her advisors had convinced her was responsible for whatever evil had befallen her precious girls. When she reached the storage section where the reading room was located, she found her daughters already being escorted out by a cluster of nervous guards. The queen pushed past everyone and fell to her knees, gathering all three children into her arms and holding them so tightly that Niera complained she could not breathe. Silithara did not care because her babies were safe and warm and giggling at their mother's unusual display of emotion. But as the relief faded and her mind cleared, the queen demanded to know what had happened and how the princesses had ended up in such a strange place. The story came out in fragments as all three girls talked over each other in their excitement to share their adventure. And it started when Aleph and Naira grew bored of their chambers and decided to explore the ship, something their tutors had strictly forbidden, but which seemed terribly exciting to two young princesses who rarely got to go anywhere without an army of attendants. They had discovered the maintenance hatches quite by accident and had realized that they were just small enough to squeeze through. Little Desha had wanted to come along, and her sisters had reluctantly agreed to bring her, mostly because she threatened to tell their mother if they left her behind. The tunnels had been dark and cramped but thrilling in a way that nothing in their pampered lives had ever been. And the three girls had crawled through the ship's hidden passages for what felt like hours, marveling at the cables and pipes and mysterious machinery all around them. But eventually, they had become lost, unable to find their way back to where they started. And the adventure had stopped being fun. Desha had started crying, and even Aleph felt tears, threatening as the reality of their situation sank in. They were lost in the bowels of a giant starship with no idea how to get home. And then Naira had spotted a hatch that led into a small room filled with books and strange furniture, and desperation had driven them to push through and tumble out onto the soft carpet of what they would later learn was the human Ambassador's private reading room. The room's computer had immediately detected their presence, and a calm voice had spoken to them in perfectly accented Valentari, asking if they were lost and if they needed assistance. The girls had been too surprised to respond at first, but the voice had continued speaking in gentle tones, explaining that the room's owner was not present but that they were welcome to stay until help arrived. The computer had offered them blankets from a storage compartment and snacks from a small food synthesizer that had been programmed with the humans' personal preferences. The snacks were strange but delicious, sweet and crunchy things that the princesses had never tasted before, and they had eaten eagerly because crawling through tunnels had made them very hungry. Then the computer had asked if they would like entertainment while they waited, and it had shown them how to access the humans' collection of holographic books and videos. The girls had discovered something called cartoons, moving pictures that told simple stories with bright colors and funny characters, and they had been enchanted immediately. Desha had stopped crying, and Alice had stopped worrying, and even careful Naira had relaxed, as they lost themselves in tales of talking animals and brave heroes from a world called Earth. The security drone had positioned itself near the door, the computer explained, to protect them from anyone who might wish them harm. It would not let strangers enter until the room's owner returned or until the day's children chose to leave on their own. The princesses had felt safe for the first time since their adventure began, cocooned in warmth and comfort, with a mechanical guardian watching over them. They had meant to ask the computer to call for help. They really had, but the cartoons were so interesting, and the blankets were so soft, and before they knew it, they had lost track of time completely. Queen Silethera listened to this tale with her expression shifting from anger to wonder to something that might have been gratitude. The humans' machines had protected her children when no one else could, had comforted them and fed them and kept them safe until help arrived. And the human himself had known nothing about it because he had been sitting in a cell the entire time, arrested on suspicion of the very crime his own equipment had prevented. The queen rose slowly to her feet and looked at Commander Veltos with eyes that had finally stopped shifting colors and settled into a deep, thoughtful blue. She needed to speak with the human, she said quietly, and she needed to do it now. Commander Marcus Chun had been sitting in his cell for nearly 12 hours when the door finally opened and Queen Silethera herself stepped through. He scrambled to his feet immediately, his heart pounding because the ruler of one of the galaxies' great empires stood before him, and he had no idea whether she had come to release him or condemn him. The queen studied him for a long moment with those strange shifting eyes that seemed to look right through his skin and into whatever lay beneath them. She spoke in a voice that carried the weight of ancient authority, but also something softer that Chun could not quite identify. She told him that his machines had saved her daughters, and that she had come to understand what had happened and to set right a terrible wrong that had been done to him. Chun listened in amazement as the queen explained how the princesses had stumbled into his reading room and how the room's computer and security drone had cared for them through the long hours of searching. He had not known any of this was possible because he had programmed those systems years ago and had mostly forgotten about them. The security protocols were standard equipment for human travelers, simple instructions that told the machines to protect and comfort any vulnerable person who entered their space-gen. Had never imagined they would be used to shelter alien royalty. Queen Silethera asked him a question that had been troubling her since she first heard the full story. Why? She wanted to know, would human machines protect children they did not recognize as valuable in voluntary society? Protection was a matter of hierarchy and worth, and you guarded what belonged to you or what had importance to your interests. But the humans' computers had treated her daughters with kindness, even though they were strangers who had entered uninvited and who offered nothing in return. Chun thought carefully before answering, because he sensed that his words mattered more than he could fully understand. He explained that humans built their machines to reflect their deepest values. And one of the deepest values his species held was the protection of children. It did not matter whose children they were, or where they came from, or whether helping them brought any benefit. Children were small and vulnerable and scared easily. And any decent being should want to keep them safe simply because they needed protecting. That was how humans saw it anyway, Chun said with a small shrug. Though he understood that other species might have different perspectives, the queen was silent for a long time, her eyes slowly changing from blue to violet to a deep gold that Chun did not know how to interpret. Finally, she spoke again, and her voice had lost some of its royal formality and gained something more personal. She told Chun that her people had always viewed humans with suspicion because the stories painted them as dangerous and unpredictable. Creatures of violence who fought endless wars and conquered everything in their path. But now she saw something that the stories had never mentioned. Something that might be more important than all the rest. Humans protected the weak, not because it was profitable or required, but because something in their nature demanded it. They built this instinct into their machines and their systems and apparently their very souls, until it became automatic and unthinking. And that, the queen admitted quietly, was indeed dangerous, but not in the way her advisors had warned. It was dangerous because it made humans difficult to predict and impossible to control, and because anyone who threatened the vulnerable would find humans standing in their way. She ordered Chen released immediately and personally escorted him back to his quarters, a gesture of respect that sent whispers racing through the ship. The advisors who had demanded his arrest watched in disbelief as their queen walked beside the human ambassador as if he were an honored guest rather than a recent prisoner. Later that evening, there was a small reception to celebrate the safe return of the princesses, and Chung found himself surrounded by Velanthari nobles who suddenly seemed very interested in learning more about his peculiar species. But the moment that stayed with him long after the voyage ended came when little Desha broke away from her attendants and ran across the room to throw her arms around his legs. She thanked him for the funny pictures and the yummy snacks and the nice voice that had told her not to be scared. And she asked if she could visit his reading room again sometime to watch more cartoons. Chun knelt down to meet her eyes and told her she would be welcome anytime. And he meant it with all his heart. Queen Silithero watched this exchange from across the room. And when Commander Velthus approached to ask what she now thought of humans, she took her time before responding. She said that she had always believed the most dangerous creatures were the ones driven by hunger or greed or ambition, because those motivations were predictable and could be managed. But humans were driven by something stranger, an instinct to protect and nurture that extended far beyond their own kind. And that made them the most dangerous species she had ever encountered. At Velthos asked if that meant they should fear the humans and work to limit their influence among the stars. The queen shook her head and said no. That was exactly the wrong conclusion to draw. Instead, they should be grateful that fate had brought them into contact with beings who would shelter lost children simply because those children needed help. And perhaps, she added with something like hope in her voice, the Velanthari could learn something from these strange creatures from the small blue world. Perhaps the galaxy might be a better place if more species built kindness into their machines and protection into their instincts. It was a dangerous thought, but it was also a beautiful one. And Queen Silithara had ruled long enough to know that the most beautiful things often carried the greatest risks. She raised her glass toward the human ambassador, who was now surrounded by her giggling daughters, and she offered a silent toast to the strange and wonderful future that lay ahead.